At the very heart of the Christian religion is the belief in the resurrection of Jesus. St. Paul states that without that belief in Jesus being raised from the dead, his faith is futile. And yet, that belief is founded on very little, if any, tangible, authenticated historical evidence. Numerous historians and biblical scholars have delved deeply in order to shed some factual light on the events that surrounded the life, death and possible resurrection of this man Jesus. But the results have varied greatly, with much depending on the predisposition of the person doing the research. There are a few books on the subject, and the propositions put forward, always based on the same available evidence, have varied from proof that Jesus was God incarnate to proof that the man never existed at all, and that the whole story of his life was no more than a myth. The big problem, of course, with research in this field is the serious lack of factual evidence. When any historian begins to research an historical subject, he intends, first of all, to look for prime sources, known facts, eyewitness accounts, literature written at the time that the events took place. The problem he has in researching the history of Jesus is that these prime sources rarely exist or do not exist. The Gospels, those that the Church eventually chose to include in the Bible, were written many years after the death of Jesus. Some were not written by the authors they are accredited to, and certainly not by eyewitnesses. It's probable that St. Mark's Gospel was written in Rome at least 50 years after the death of Jesus, and there is ample scope to believe that a lot of what was written was done so in order to promote and establish the emergent new religion of Christianity. It's interesting to note that chronologically St. Paul was the first to write about Jesus, yet there is very little mention in his writings about the miraculous events surrounding the life that we find in the later Gospels. The fact is, there are no valid eyewitness accounts and little, if any, physical evidence of the existence of Jesus of Nazareth. Any stories that did purport to come from eyewitnesses would have been passed down via the oral tradition, as it's fairly accepted that most of the population at that time and in that region would not be literate. It would have been slightly skewed. So the stories would be told and conversions would take place, and as time passed, the stories would inevitably become embellished as time moved on from the factual events. And especially if the purpose of telling those stories was to convert more people to this new religion. And then, of course, there's the problem of misinterpretation. We all know how difficult it can be to accurately convey the meaning contained in one language into another, especially when one that is totally different from the original. Aramaic to Greek, Greek to English, and Old English at that could easily result in linguistic distortions of words and phrases that entirely change the meaning of the original narratives. But I think what's paramount important is that we tend to read the biblical texts through the eyes of the 21st century and interpret the meanings through a 21st century consciousness. For example, today, for most believers, God and heaven and we in our earthly human existence are generally thought of as being two totally different realms with very little interaction. In the time of Jesus, however, and for centuries before, interaction between gods and humans was a generally accepted fact and quite a common occurrence in the mythology of the time. Gods would come to earth and do great deeds, or they would come and produce marvellous offspring with chosen mortals, and some humans could become gods as a result of their deeds on earth. This is more of a pagan tradition, but it can also be detected in certain parts of Jewish history with the deification of their kings. For example, King David was regarded as a god, and we should note with interest that Jesus' lineage at one point traced back to King David in the Bible. So for a human being, to become God was not, or become a God, was not an uncommon occurrence in the times that we're looking at. The necessary criteria being simply that the human being in question had performed deeds of great note, or had become someone of high regard. Similarly, resurrections, virgin births, were a very common feature of mythology at that time. The parallels between the story of Jesus and the numerous gods of that era and before are quite staggering. The ancient mythological traditions abound with stories of virgin births, miracles of every kind, and the regular occurrence of gods and heroes coming back to life after suffering some sort of dreadful demise. So, even though to our modern sensibilities the idea of men becoming gods or God and coming to earth by the womb of a virgin, or gods allowing themselves to be sacrificed and then rising from the dead, is understandably difficult to our modern scientific sensibilities, difficult to accept. But to the illiterate peasant living in the Middle East 2,000 years ago, and indeed even to the intelligentsia of that time, none of this would have been particularly out of the ordinary. So we're left with a problem. As Unitarians, we pride ourselves on seeking out the truth. But when it comes to validating or refuting the resurrection, we can only trust to our own instincts and any knowledge that we have gleaned from the more learned and insightful researchers. As a non-Christian, I don't believe for one moment that any miracles have actually taken place, or that any physical resurrections have occurred at any point in human history. I love the comment by Thomas Paine that the occurrence of these miraculous events seems, curiously enough, to have diminished in proportion to the development of our ability to scrutinize their validity. But what is interesting is how and why these stories developed and became such a staple part of man's thinking, how these ideas became so deeply ingrained in the human psyche, that they occur and recur in the diverse and disparate societies which existed in those ancient times. One theory is that they came about as a result of an existence that necessitated a much more intimate relationship with nature and a deeper, if not rather more simplistic, understanding of the workings of nature. In an agrarian society, death is a common feature. Animals are slaughtered, crops cut down for sustenance. There is a regular sacrifice of life for the good of the population. But new animals are husbanded to replace the old, and the seeds of the old crops produce the new ones on a regular basis. Life is cyclical, and death, whether natural or imposed, is an important, if not essential, part of that cycle. The old giving way to the new. There's a saying, there's nothing new under heaven or earth. And if we are to believe what up to now has been accepted as scientific fact, that matter or energy can neither be created or destroyed, then it goes a long way to explaining why death and destruction are an integral part of life on earth. If something new is to be created or to develop, then what constitutes that new creation or development must come from the demise or transformation of what already exists. So rather than seeing death or destruction as an end, if we think of it in cyclical terms, it becomes instead a transformation, an evolution, a rebirth. And isn't that what Easter Sunday and the stories of the resurrection are really about? What we're really celebrating today, though it's couched in religious form, is the rebirth of the sun, the emergence of new life, the earth coming back to life and being re-energized after the darkness and cold of the winter. Darkness and light, death and rebirth, sacrifice, resurrection. All aspects of the cyclical nature of life that have become deeply, deeply ingrained in the collective subconscious over the vast amount of time that it has been experienced by our ancestors. But coming back to the present, it strikes me that this Easter, this celebration of resurrection and rebirth, is particularly relevant to us as a congregation when we consider the recent decisions taken with regard to our future. I think it's fair to say that for a while in the recent past, the future of this church looked quite bleak. A dwindling congregation, a building that was, and still is in fact, draining us financially and spiritually, and dare I say, the lack of cohesion about the spiritual direction that Unitarianism should take now that it has ceased to be exclusively Christian. I was quite hardened recently to hear Tom McCready voice an issue that has troubled me for some time. In a nutshell, it's simply this. What does it hold, what does the future hold for a movement whose reason for being and prime objective was the promotion of religious tolerance, now that religious tolerance is the accepted norm in a civilized, enlightened society? When William Turner was minister at Hanover Chapel in Newcastle, he couldn't hold public office in this country unless you accepted certain religious principles dictated by the established church. And taking the sacrament was a prerequisite for holding any government position. The battle that Turner was integral in has now been won. We no longer have those intolerant religious restrictions imposed upon our daily lives. But the remnants of the army, us, is still on the battlefield, kind of looking for something to do. That's not to say that we should shout hooray and take down the flags, pack our bags and go home. Nor that Unitarianism is an anachronism that has served its purpose. But this may well be an opportune time to re-examine what our core purpose is, what Unitarianism now stands for, and what our relevance to modern society is or could be. For me, as I lean towards the more humanistic side of Unitarianism, it would be more to do with helping individuals find their own, what we call spiritual path and fulfillment, involvement in good causes, helping our local community in a practical way, and in the promotion of both physical and spiritual care for those who need it. That's my take on it, others will have differing views. But I think that we all need to agree on is that some form of adaptation is going to be necessary if we want our church or Unitarianism to survive. And that change will probably result from the impending change to our physical circumstances. A change that will have to be handled with great care, just like the birth of a newborn baby. So the story of Easter, whether myth, legend or fact, is one of regeneration, transformation and renewed hope for the future. It's about the old giving way to the new, darkness being replaced by light, despair by hope. I'm sure I can speak for all the longer serving members of this church, and I think I'm probably the only one here present today. When I say that, for the past year or so, there has been a new and refreshing air about this church. There seems to have been an injection of youth and energy that has been missing from our congregation for some time. And most of all, important of all, there seems to be a renewed and growing hope for the future, especially now that the decision to relinquish certain aspects of the past has finally been taken. But that hope, I think, is very much reliant on a willingness on all our behalf to embrace change, to move on, and to take that leap of faith into the unknown. Without change, we may never know what could have been, and how our lives and the future of this church would have been affected. But I believe that we can be certain that without change, Unitarianism in Newcastle would very likely struggle to survive. The time has come, I think, for us soldiers milling about on the victorious battlefield to muster and march off to face new challenges, but happy in the knowledge that we are better equipped and better able to face those new challenges, armed with the lessons that have been learned from the past. Recently came across a quotation that struck me as very pertinent to our present circumstances. To paraphrase it, it simply says, "Unless you strive to progress and grow, you will almost certainly regress and diminish." And I'll leave you with some more words from Craig Lounsborough. In the oddity, or maybe the miracle of life, the roots of something new frequently lie in the decaying husk of something old.